Hello, good afternoon. My name is Chris Nagel. I'm an attorney here at Holland and Knight. And every month we host a webinar for our government contracts and other clients for topics that may be of interest to them. I am a government contracts lawyer myself. And so I usually take the opportunity to interview experts in different fields and ask them questions that I'm hearing from my clients. This month, we're thrilled to have Lisa Barkovic. She's in our policy office in downtown DC, and she's been following the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And so she's going to share some of her expertise and experience with us. And hopefully we'll get through some questions that will provide some useful information for folks. Here's what we're hoping to accomplish over the next hour. A high-level overview of the IIJA, identify strategic opportunities. A lot of times we talk about legal issues here, and we will talk about some legal issues from a compliance standpoint, but certainly part of the interest in this particular legislation is just the sheer number of dollars that are being spent, as Lisa will talk us through in a minute. But in addition to reauthorizing old funding programs, there's also a lot of new funding programs. And so for our clients, this is a potential strategic opportunity to grow business. New categories of federal spending, as I mentioned, in addition to the reauthorization and the interplay with the existing rules and how that's going to work moving forward. And then finally, the part that's probably closest to what I do, which is potential compliance risks. So areas of focus, this new law has adopted and also in some ways expanded current compliance issues that would come along with any other federal or state and local government contract procurement process. And so our hope today is we won't be able to drill too far into any of these topics in just an hour, but the hope is that we flag some items to look for and maybe some items for follow-up. I will do my best to track the question and answer box. So if you've got questions, please go ahead and pose them. And I'll do my best to track them as we're going through and ask Lisa. You'll see at the end of the presentation, we'll have our contact information, so you can certainly follow up directly with us if that would be helpful. Okay, with that, Lisa, let's get started. Give us a high-level overview of what the law is and why it may be important to our clients.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. So the bipartisan infrastructure law that President Biden signed into law this past November is really our surface transportation reauthorization bill that Congress reauthorizes on a 5 to 6 year basis. So this is updating the FAST Act, and prior to the FAST Act, it was the MAP 21 legislation. So that is what is at the heart of this bill. You'll also see that there were several other authorizing pieces of legislation that got tacked onto it that are related to water and wastewater infrastructure, energy infrastructure, digital equity, and recycling. Next slide.
Well, yeah, and let me just make a comment there, Lisa. I think one thing that's important to note, when you look at the numbers, $550 billion in new spending. Now that's spread out over 5 years, but just to put that in perspective, in FY 2020, the government spent a total of $665 billion. So this is a massive plus up. Again, spread out over 5 years, and I'm comparing it to a 1 year total, but I think it puts in perspective just how much additional money is getting pumped in through the new law. And then of course, as Lisa mentioned, the old.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
So, and just the key point on that is if you're looking just specifically at what the Department of Transportation has, by their count, they have over 44 new grant programs that they will be implementing. They're starting right away. We can talk about what the implementation efforts have been to date, but we have dozens of new programs. Some are formula, some are discretionary. Across several of the different agencies, not only at DOT, but Department of Energy, as well as, Department of Homeland Security. And we have a new cybersecurity grant program. So I'm going to cover those. I'm going to talk about some of the formula programs that we have, the resilience, carbon reduction. We have a new bridge program, which I think maybe some of you all had heard last month, President Biden had already announced the formula of funding for the new bridge program. charging infrastructure. And we have a good focus right now, particularly this administration, they're focused on safety. It's their #1 mission in life. We just saw Secretary Buttigieg a couple of weeks ago announce a new national roadway safety action plan. And this is just in response to the number of accidents and deaths that have increased over the couple of years. We're also looking at expanding eligibilities for existing programs. And I can talk a little bit more in depth about some of that, but that is like looking at your surface transportation block grant program. Well, now electric vehicle infrastructure is an added eligibility. And so these are things to kind of be mindful where we think we are so used to seeing some of the existing programs. Well, they've been updated with these new eligibilities that expand the program, but also new requirements that we're gonna have to pay attention to. That includes the new Buy America requirements as well as some new workforce provisions.
And Lisa, when you say formula versus discretionary, what do you mean by that?
So formula is a guaranteed amount that comes out on an annual basis. And so usually the formula dollars are your traditional programs like the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, where each state is guaranteed an amount going to have to draft an application and submit it to the DOT and then advocate for your project in hopes that you would be awarded some discretionary or competitive funding.
So these are mostly state and local procurements. So you're talking about state and local governments getting either formulaic or discretionary funds, and then they compete to see who gets that work. They put out a procurement from the state and local level?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Okay, so helpful to keep in mind, I think, and it would be good, I think, for our clients to hear too, if there is, federal funding, we should be looking to directly to the agency, or this is going to be on the state and local level. It sounds like from what you're saying, most of it is state and local. That's where the dollars will come from the feds, but it will be it'll be contracted out, and the RFPs, the solicitations will come out from state and local. So
that's right.
With most of it. Okay. All right.
So next slide. Okay. So I'm just going to get started and talk about some of the new programs that the Department of Transportation will have. We have a stopping threats on pedestrians. I mean, think of this as in your city or your county, you have a courthouse or some type of other important infrastructure that you would like to protect with Ballard installation. Safe streets and roads for all. This is a vision, like a Vision Zero type grant program. Again, these are competitive programs. You will have to put an application together and submit it to DOT. You'll have to advocate for it, asking, maybe your members of Congress to write a support letter for you. And just as I'm going through this list too, you'll see this funding is over 5 years. I mean, as a bill for a 5-year thing, so that money is going to be split up. So where you see $5 billion over 5 years, think of that as $1 billion for each of the next 5 years. A congestion relief program. Congestion relief program. This is for large urbanized areas. The SMART program, if you might recall, when President Obama was in office, he had a smart city grant opportunity. So this SMART program is basically that smart city opportunity, but more on a diet per se. The culvert removal, replacement, and restoration program. This is all new competitive grant programs that local governments, transportation planning agencies are all eligible to apply. Reconnecting communities. This administration, the Biden-Harris administration, is really focused on helping disadvantaged communities. And that's a theme that you're going to see over and over again in many of the competitive grant programs. And so Reconnecting Communities is really looking at those communities that had some type of transportation project, maybe from the 50s, that really segregated neighborhoods and cut them off. This is going to help mitigate some of those existing transportation projects that created barriers to mobility and access and economic development. We have a new railroad crossing elimination competitive program that just is going to be for elimination of hazards at rail highway crossings. And then the National Infrastructure Project Assistance Program. Just a little tidbit, the nickname for this new program is MEGA. So when you start hearing somebody talk about the MEGA DOT grant program, this is what this is referring to, the National Infrastructure Assistance. It's very similar to the current infra competitive grant program.
So when you say grant, Lisa, you're talking about a grant to the state or local authority, but am I right in assuming that it will largely be contracted by those local governments? In other words, it's not going to be a grant to the contractor. It's not going to be a grant to the construction company or the broadband infrastructure provider, but instead it's going to be competitively bid at that level.
It's going to be competitive. Yep. This is when we use the words discretionary, competitive, and grant kind of interchangeable amongst in describing all of these programs. And so yes, they will all be having to submit an application to see if they would be successful in obtaining the funding.
And are you seeing contractors, private entities, advocate on behalf of some of these programs to try to push, or do you expect to see some of the private entities being in communication with their state, local government authorities to try to encourage them, hey, go after this money, we've got an opportunity here?
Absolutely. I'll give one example. I'm just covering right now the new programs that were created, but there are existing programs like the RAISE program, which you might also know it as Build or Tiger. And there is right now, it's actually a current opportunity that's open right now. And I'm just talking about this because they changed the grant size minimum for planning grants, so which is now 5 million. We think there might be a legislative fix that comes and removes that. But when you're thinking of yourself as a planner, a contractor, that helps plan these projects, being able to get a $5 million planning grant versus the typical, $1 million planning grant. And there's a lot of money that could be at stake for transportation planners across the country, because that's just a significant amount of money. And so contractors are usually working with the local government entities, reaching out to help prepare these grant applications too. And so it's a very collaborative process. And if it's not, I recommend that, you do what you can to make it a collaborative process, because I think the more people that can be helpful towards, be a part of an application, I think the more successful you're going to be.
Yeah, so as opposed to waiting until you see the RFP hit the street from this state entity or this local government entity, working with them on the front end as they're applying for the money.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, this RAISE program that's open now, I'm working with a local government, and when they weren't too sure about their project, and I recommended to them, why don't you reach out to your local state DOT, your state DOT rep? Maybe your project is on their list and maybe they're looking for something. And actually it turned out to be a very good conversation. Their state DOT was very interested in their project and actually wanted to put it forth. So now we have a partnership at hand where the state DOT and the city are going to be working together on submitting a RAISE grant application. And so it's these types of important conversations that should be happening. And if you're preparing to submit for one of these new programs in the future when it opens, you'll be a step ahead of the game.
Great.
So there are two new bridge programs that are included in the IIJA. I referenced the Formula Bridge program. That money has already been the Bridge Replacement Rehabilitation Program. So you saw that announcement from President Biden for $27 billion. And unfortunately, the timing of that was kind of weird with the news of the bridge falling down in Pittsburgh, right? I'm sure we all saw that on the news with the bus there. And then there's going to be a competitive program. So if the state came back and said, well, your bridge is not on our priority list, but here's another opportunity for maybe you to get your bridge project move forward, you can do it through a competitive process, which would be $16 billion over 5 years. And then the last program that I have here on this list is the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program. And one thing I'm going to point out here is this pot of money is actually subject to the appropriations process. So it did not get guaranteed funding in the IIJA. And so we have to work with Congress to advocate that money gets appropriated to this program every year now for the next 5 years. And that $1 billion over 5 years is basically what we refer to as that's your hunting license to get the appropriation. So we could get as much as maybe 100 million per year, maybe a little bit more, just depending on how that will be set up by the appropriators. So now we're kind of on our key transportation resiliency programs, and just another, hallmark of the Biden-Harris administration. We have the Promoting Resilient Operations for Transformative, Efficient, Cost-Saving Transportation grant program. These are our Protect grant programs, and it's divided up by 2 ways. It's going to be formula funding to your state DOTs, and then you can also apply for a Protect grant on a competitive basis. So in total, I mean, there is close to 10 billion in funding over the next 5 years for both the formula and for the competitive programs. And this is just about looking at what do you make your at-risk coastal highways that might be at risk for flooding or hurricanes, and you have to redo your, update your hurricane evacuation routes or wildfire routes, anything that will help you have a more resilient transportation network. Carbon reduction program, again, new formula program, your funding will be coming through the state DOT. Healthy Streets program, this is looking at tree canopies and innovative asphalt type projects. If you're, in the West and your roads are hot, and what is it that we can do that to help deploy cool pavements and expand tree cover. We also have the EV program, charging and refueling, and then we have an EV charging formula program.
It strikes me, Lisa, that a lot of these programs likely would not have been in sort of your traditional 5-year cycle of infrastructure reauthorization. In other words, these may involve companies who otherwise, and for that matter, parts of state and local government who otherwise would not have been involved in this process in years past. Are you seeing that? Are you seeing new entrants into the pool of money here through this new law?
Definitely seeing the new money pulled. I mean, you're correct. We wouldn't normally kind of see the expansion of all of these types of programs through reauthorization. So I think that is something kind of to know when we're looking at 5 years from now, updating current, and what does that look like? It is a lot. And what I'll tell you why this wouldn't probably have happened in the past years. This is requiring a lot of infrastructure for the Department of Transportation to put together. So when we reach out to our friends there and we're talking with them, they will say that there's a need to hire 800 people at the U.S. Department of Transportation to help with these new programs. It takes, a lot of time and effort to set them up, implement them. We're talking about new staff that have to review the competitive grant applications that get submitted. And so there are plenty of times in the past where I think people are like, whoa, this is too much. How do we simplify all of these various different programs into maybe something more manageable? But this is where we're at right now.
Great.
So just a quick snapshot of implementation actions to date. Everybody wants to know how quickly we're going to see things. So I've already mentioned a lot of this stuff already. The bridge funding announced. We have an EV charging action plan. We have the National Road Safety Strategy that came out just this week. We had the announcement of the Port Infrastructure Development grant opportunities open. So they will be due, applications are due May 16th. So there is a lot that is happening. And one thing I will let you know, the White House is working really hard to oversee implementation. So they have, if you, I can get you the website later, they've have put out a guidebook. It's a 400-page guidebook to kind of walk you through all of the grant programs that will be coming out, expected timelines on those grants. They're also hosting right now various different webinars on for each of the different issue areas. So after this webinar, the FTA is having one on public transportation. And so we can also provide, after our discussion today, some of those key information and links, so you can look at what the White House is also putting out. We have, the White House even has an announced an implementation coordinator. So former Mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, is helping oversee the coordination efforts, not only between the White House and DOT, but with all the other departments and agencies. So it's taking quite a lot to make sure that this is implemented in the right way. EV is such a huge part of the new programs that it'd be helpful to kind of give you just a little bit of a timeline of what to expect as it relates to the charging refueling grant program. So you can see here, we already have some key dates that are put up there and expected timeframes. So I will say we do see issue guidance and standards for state and local governments no later than February 14th. That actually has been pushed back a little bit, but the White House is still convening their stakeholder meetings on these topics. And then we expect that we will actually see the standards for the EV chargers issued by DOT by no later than May 13th. And then of course, the key thing here is we have a statutory deadline for DOT to establish the program by October 2022.
So once the program is established, Lisa, then is it, I guess, then you've got the application process, and then before the money actually hits the street, so to speak, there's still a couple of steps involved, but at least by October, we should have a sense of what the timeline will be for dollars. Right.
And then on the EV formula program, again, the DOT is required to establish the program by October 2022. And these are the, you know, just how we continue to monitor the rollout of this program. I think one of the big key things that we'll be looking towards in the second quarter of this year is the launching of an advisory committee on electric vehicles. And who will make that advisory committee, I think will say a lot of the direction of the program. And then obviously DOT will be updating and redesignating alternative fuel corridors.
You said something that was interesting before, that it sounds like there's more public outreach maybe than usual from the administration with respect to these plans, and particularly sort of in a subject matter bucket by bucket, as opposed to each specific individual reauthorized program, but rather if a company or a local government is interested in a specific topic, that there's additional kind of follow-on guidance that we can either provide or point them to that's coming from the administration.
Yeah, no, they're doing stakeholder meetings on almost every new program I've been seeing, just trying to kind of communicate with folks, you know, what this might look like, so they everything is always about preparation and getting you prepared for the money. And I think a lot of that is due to the fact that with the news of this deal coming together and then it getting signed into law, you know I had a lot of people call me and say, we don't want to leave, we want all the money. We don't want to leave anything on the table. We don't want to miss an opportunity. And really, you know, it's these types of conversations that are important to say, well, if you're not ready this year, don't worry, you're going to have another bite at the apple next year. And you're going to have, you know, 5 bites at the apple on this for the next 5 years. This is not like the stimulus bill that got passed in 2009 under when Obama first took office. This is very different from a stimulus bill. And so this is why we're having these conversations and talks. It's all about preparation and communicating how everything will be rolled out. I'm just going to kind of touch quickly on some of the key transit provisions. A lot of it is existing programs, but we do have some new programs that were created. We have, for example, a new electric or low emitting ferry grant program. We have a rail car replacement program. This is really for your older transit systems across the country, like New York and Chicago, and then all station accessibility again, for those well-established transit programs. And just quick, I don't have that in the slide, but transit has probably one of the largest investments made to it through this legislation. And so these programs that are existing are getting, tons more money. But they also are changing some of the requirements in the existing grant programs. So bus and bus facilities has always, been a traditional existing grant program. But some of the key things to note now is that for 5% of all the competitive grants that are related to zero emission vehicles must have workforce development activities included in that application. It also is requiring for grant opportunities that have zero emission fleet vehicle acquisition, they have to have a transition plan to go for, maybe your diesel buses that are beyond its useful life and looking towards what they need to do to transition its fleet to, maybe an all electric. And so these are new requirements that we're seeing in these notices of funding. One of the other things I will note here too is they also said that the FTA has to release its notice of funding for bus and bus facilities 30 days after the annual appropriation bill gets signed into law. So if we see an omnibus bill be produced by Congress in the next week or so, and it heads to the president's desk, then you'll know exactly 30 days from that date, the FTA will have to release a new solicitation of funding for bus and bus facilities. And so that's something to kind of keep in mind. Congress throughout the IIJA was either silent on when the departments and agencies had to release a notice of funding, or they provided statutory guidelines or statutory deadlines. And so that's sometimes why you see there's a rush to get a grant application, out on grants.gov, and then you look at it and you're like, oh, this is only 10 pages, and it says DOT will update it, within the next 2 weeks. The reason why they're rushing that is because they're just trying to meet a statutory deadline, but they haven't fully finished writing all of the grant criteria that it will be in that notice.
And it sounds like this is beyond just your typical construction infrastructure work. I mean, when you're talking about the low emissions and sort of EV, and it sounds like, and if it's bus facilities, I'm guessing there's infrastructure, software and hardware that go into running those types of facilities. I mean, it seems like it's more expansive maybe than you would expect an infrastructure bill to be.
Yeah, and the facilities part is really important here, because when you're emphasizing investments in electric buses, your current facility might not be able to properly maintain those buses the way your facility is currently set up. So I do know that there are lots of transit agencies out there that are having to rethink what their maintenance facilities will look like in terms of being able to transition to electric fleets, or maybe they have a current transfer station and the canopy doesn't fit the new bus, and so the buses get parked out on a street. And so there's lots of things that you have to think about in terms of the transition to electric vehicles. So the facilities part is, I think, a very important component.
We have a question here, and for any of these, Lisa, the answer might be just, we'll circle back with you. I want to put you on the spot, but this question. Access and equity. Does that strike a chord with you? Any feedback?
Absolutely. So I haven't really touched on this, but this is a great question and good timing. You will notice that a lot of these new grant programs, one of the other criteria that they're looking at is equity. And they're looking at, prioritizing investments in disadvantaged communities. They are looking, President Biden has a Justice 40 initiative, and every application that, and I say every, there might be a few that don't require it, but I would be prepared to discuss how you're going to meet the Justice 40 initiative goals and how your investment might be helping a disadvantaged community. And so if you look at DOT's website, you'll see that they have a tool on there that helps you kind of get to the heart of the matter of, like, if you're a contractor and you're looking at certain places where projects might be, kind of focusing on some of those areas where when you play around the tool, they identify certain neighborhoods as disadvantaged. Similar to what the former administration was doing when they were talking about opportunity zones, right? So I, would recommend checking out those calculators that DOT has on its website, and then just getting yourself refreshed with the Justice 40 initiative and what you can do there, because that will be a big part of being successful in getting a grant.
Great. That's a good question and a good answer. All right. Here we go.
So I just kind of put together a quick snapshot of notice of funding opportunities that are coming soon or already opened. So I talked about RAISE that closes April 14th. We had the Port Infrastructure Development open on the 14th and closes May 16th. I will say we were expecting low to no emissions to open this month, but because of the workforce provisions and changes in the IIJA, they had to do a little bit more work. So I'm expecting we'll see low to no emissions come out also in the March timeframe, bus and bus facilities. And again, I mentioned that guidebook several minutes ago. That guidebook also has this type of expected timelines associated with it.
We got another question here, which is, how should agencies expect to track the 5% workforce development activities? In other words, do we know what the FTA will be looking for in this area?
For the most part, yes. Last May, both the FHWA and the FTA have put out in the Federal Register and on their websites a pilot program on including workforce development issues. Now, they just had to rescind that pilot program. So I think if you look in the Federal Register a couple of weeks ago, you'll see those rescissions, and they just had to do it so that they fully align the policy with what was in the IIJA. But I think if you go back and read that, that will give you very good insight on how to prepare for that 5% workforce development.
Great. These are issues that are a little closer to home for me doing pure legal work. So I'm interested to hear the new kind of the new compliance requirements be attached to this new funding?
Yeah, so this is just a snapshot of the key workforce and Buy American provisions. Obviously, includes Davis-Bacon wage requirements for most of the major highway programs. We have Buy America waivers for some Title 23 projects, but will require public notice of proposed waivers. And there will be an annual report to Congress. And then new Buy America requirements apply to all infrastructure projects receiving federal financial assistance. So, you know, this is really important because I think, you know, if you are working on like maybe a port application and you have components of that project that there's no way you can comply with a Buy America provision, you know, you might think about segmenting your project and pulling out some of those parts if it were to make sense, if you could still have a project that's a standalone project, you know, so you meet those Buy America requirements. So these are the changes here that I've listed out. And then Chris, I don't know if you want to go to the next slide because I continue. And then the local hiring preference, another big deal. So this is going to permit a recipient or a subrecipient, so that's the contracting side of things, to implement a local or other geographical or economic hiring preference relating to the use of labor for construction projects. Requires DOT to submit a workforce diversity report to Congress, as well as a model plan for your states and local governments and private sector entities to use. And then you have to address methods to enhance pre-apprenticeship programs, improving transportation workforce diversity, and encouraging subrecipients to establish outreach and support programs. For surface transportation workforce development, training, education, that also needs to include a variety of training and employment activities. And then we also are under transportation education, we're expanding eligibility to state DOTs and partnerships with federal departments and agencies. So again, the local workforce, local hiring preference, I mean, that's a very big deal and key thing to note. And some of the grant applications you will submit will have to have that addressed.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I'll just point out on this previous slide to underscore sort of the complexity of some of this. Most folks on the call probably know Buy America, distinct from the Buy American Act, which we do usually a lot more of on the government contracting side. But Buy America typically is roped in with infrastructure and transportation projects. But then separate and apart from that, there are international treaty requirements, believe it or not, that are imposed on state entities, on some state entities, such that if the Buy America, which is a domestic preference law, would otherwise require that the procurement be made on a specifically, you know, only on a domestically sourced product or service, some of those treaties actually prohibit the state or local entity from procuring under those conditions and effectively discriminating against one of the US's trade partners that's listed on that treaty. So, and then usually you've got this big carve out for infrastructure type procurements. But in this case, where the law has expanded so much beyond what we've traditionally seen as infrastructure, where you have things environmentally focused requirements and funding under those buckets, well, that carve out may no longer apply, meaning that the states, you know, typically would say we have to do this domestically sourced, but in that case, the treaty would supersede the otherwise Buy America requirements. And so there's a couple of layers to this that can get really complicated. And I think it's just an important reminder to make sure you've kind of followed the trail all the way through, not necessarily taking at face value. We know that these rules apply in every situation in the same way, because this is a new way of procuring, quote, infrastructure. We've expanded what infrastructure means. And then the kind of second and third order consequences of that sometimes can make things more complicated. Sometimes they make it harder. Other times they may make it easier, where you've got a situation, state and local government may not realize we don't have to buy, made in the U.S. domestically sourced things in this particular situation. The IIJA is clear that the governments, that the procuring agencies are supposed to follow the U.S.'s international obligations as well. So anyway, you got a lot of moving parts there. But I think it's worth kind of running to ground if you're hitting obstacles or ways that may be advantageous from a business perspective, to make sure that the folks who are doing the procuring at the state and local level have a full understanding of the complexity at the federal level of how these rules are supposed to be implemented.
Those are great points. It is complex, and you have to be aware of it, and we're here to help.
Yeah. I don't know all that, but I know some of your colleagues and some of my colleagues together kind of can piece out, do a patchwork of legal and policy work, and get the ground truth most of the time. Okay, water infrastructure.
So just briefly on water infrastructure, you might have noticed this is just the implementation actions to date. So the EPA has been out front, kind of outlining the key priorities for water investments. We're expecting any day now for the EPA to release its notice of funding opportunity for brownfield revitalization efforts. So within brownfields, there are kind of a couple different subheaders of its grant programs. And the other thing that they've done to date is $7.4 billion in funding allocations for states, upgrading America's water infrastructure. Last week, they just announced all of a funding opportunity for lead pipe replacement. And the Army Corps of Engineers also updated its work plan funding, where we have a lot of new start projects that are get Army Corps of Engineers funding for like flood control projects, levees, et cetera. And that was $14 billion that they just announced last month. So just kind of, I talked about the Emergency Watershed Protection Program. Like, we're expecting brownfields any day now. And then we're also going to see later this spring the water and groundwater storage conveyance program. Broadband and digital equity is a huge cornerstone of this administration. I think all of us working from home during COVID and going to school realized there are a lot of places across the country that need updates or just need the infrastructure in the first place. So we'll see here, we have the Middle Mile Broadband Infrastructure Program. This is $1 billion over 5 years. Digital Equity Competitive Grant Program. This is competitive grants for local governments and nonprofits for their broadband projects. We have almost $14.5 billion for the Affordable Connectivity Program. This was formerly known as the Emergency Broadband Benefit. So now it makes the program permanent. We have a subsidy of $30 a month. And we're saving the best for last. The biggest chunk of money is for the Broadband Equity and Access and Deployment Program. We have $42.5 billion over the next 5 years. This is a formula-based program to the states to competitively award grants then within the states for qualifying infrastructure, mapping, and adoption projects.
This seems like an example, Lisa, of new, I would imagine, a lot of new money being spent in ways that it wasn't previously under the infrastructure, under previous infrastructure authorization bills. And so I would guess you're seeing new now technology providers, software, hardware, satellite link up, all sorts of, this money now becomes available, it seems to me, to a new group of potential contractors once it makes its way to the state and local level.
Definitely a new group of contractors. And, I really wanted to point out that that digital equity competitive program, I mean, that's also open to nonprofits. You have, so many nonprofits that had to kind of change how they delivered their services during COVID, and being able to rely on that through broadband and their customers through broadband. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to also work with maybe some people that traditionally haven't been in this mix before, to kind of think about who those folks will be. Getting towards the end here. So key cybersecurity and public safety provisions. Obviously, cybersecurity is a huge, huge deal. Don't want to underscore that, particularly, as we're facing new cybersecurity risks every day, not only within the country, but from the international arena too. So we have a new state and local cybersecurity grant program that was created. This program, DHS has been holding lots of stakeholder meetings on this program already. This money will flow to the states, and then the states will distribute to local governments. So there'll be probably competitions within the states on this funding, and $1 billion authorized over 5 years. I will say, but this program is not evenly divided over the next 5 years. Like 1 year we'll get close to 400 million, and the next 300. So they have it kind of split up. Our state and local government's ability to address cybersecurity risks and threats. We also have a cyber response and recovery fund that has been created. So 100 million authorized over the next 5 years. And again, this is set up for reimbursement and technical assistance following significant cyber incidents. And then, so those are, I think, 2 key new programs that I think you probably will see a lot of growth in over the next couple of years. And that is all being run by CISA and DHS. And then also at DHS, but within FEMA, is the BRIC program. This is your pre-disaster mitigation grant program. This is a plus up of funding that it typically gets on an annual basis. So it is supporting pre-disaster and hazard mitigation activities undertaken by states and local governments. So, you can see storm shelters get approved, or flood control projects, or new alert systems. Those are all types of eligible projects under BRIC. But it just kind of goes along with the administration's theme of, we have a lot of risk because of climate change, and how do we kind of continue to invest in our infrastructure to make us more resilient.
And going back to the cyber authorizations and these new programs, you said the money will go to the states, and then the local governments will compete, is how you expect it to play out?
Yeah. Yep.
And then, but I'm assuming once it gets to the local level, you're not expecting the local governments to implement these programs themselves, but probably contract out a lot of that work.
Right. That's exactly right.
Another sort of pool of, the folks we deal with on the federal contractor side, obviously cyber is huge. A whole subset of government contractors do that type of work for the federal government. Mm-hmm. It seems to me this is now a new opportunity for companies in that space and related spaces potentially to look to this funding and coming through local governments as opposed to their normal federal government customers. And I guess those who are in the commercial space as well as government contractors who are offering this type of cybersecurity, just like we said with broadband before. So hopefully another strategic opportunity, and for folks that are in that space, can follow up and drill down further, and we can provide some additional guidance in terms of when and how those funds are going to be put out.
I actually, I've been involved in some of those stakeholder briefings that CISA has had on this program. And so I have a lot more details of how they expect that program to be set up. They're expecting it to be announced towards the end of the second quarter of this year, early third quarter. And so happy to also, if anybody is interested in some of the more further nitty-gritty details, happy to provide those.
Great.
So just, again, just a snapshot on implementation actions today, because I just know people are trying to follow everything that's happening. The USDA is accepting applications right now for the Reconnect Rural Broadband program. I actually think they're due fairly soon. So just kind of take that as a note. The NTIA has been hosting its listening sessions. They've also have published a request for comment seeking public input on design and implementation of the broadband equity access and deployment program. That's that big program I mentioned. And the FCC has launched the Affordable Connectivity Program, providing broadband subsidies up to $30 a month. So lots already happening in this space. Like I said, to February 22nd. So that just closed, but Reconnect is one of these programs that has been existing for the past couple of years. So it will reopen again, probably later this fall. And so then the rest of the grants, middle mile, the state and local cybersecurity, and the energy sector.
But Lisa, these are grant applications due from state and or local governments. So it wouldn't be, you know, if we've got clients or folks that are listening in who are on the private sector side of this, who provide these services, they're not going to. This doesn't mean their opportunity is closed. It just means that the states or whoever the local entity is that's vying for the dollars, well, that process has started, but then there'll be a separate procurement process later on down the road, I would expect, right, for actually contracting out the services.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's
probably if they were to get, let's say they would get a grant award through the state and local cybersecurity grant program. If they already haven't identified within their application exactly who they might be working with, they will have to put out an RFP requesting, you know, contractors and businesses, private entities to, you know, provide a response to whether or not they can help them perform the, you know, the actions that they said they would be taking as part of accepting that grant award.
Yeah, so really for our clients and attendees who are in this space, this is just the beginning, but to find out who is awarded those grants, then it seems to me that will drive those communications with those specific state and local governments to say, we know you've got this grant for this cyber program, for this broadband access program, we can help in these ways, and trying to shape what that RFP looks like that you just mentioned. That strikes me as kind of the next step for folks that are on the private side of this.
Absolutely. On the clean energy and environment front, just kind of recapturing some of the implementation actions to date. And we have lots of requests for information that have been released and out there. So I think that's one thing, you know, if you're looking to, you know, submit comments or some feedback about how you might see some of these new programs be shaped, I would pay attention to the Federal Register and what, you know, feedback you can provide to these RFI requests. Other than that, DOE has launched a new Building a Better Grid initiative. The EPA has also announced $1 billion in Superfund sites. So that is just kind of another area to help accelerate cleanup at dozens of these sites across the country. And then we have a guidance that has been out there for cap and plug orphaned oil and gas wells.
We have another question that echoes some of my confusion as a government contracts lawyer. Somebody says, I'm still confused by your reference to, quote, grants throughout this slide deck. Are you referring to opportunities under 2 CFR 200 uniform guidance? And I'll give you my perspective on that, and then you can give me your, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Lisa, but you know, 2 CFR 200 generally deals with grants coming directly from the federal government to a private entity. I guess it could be a state or local entity as well, but I think of it from my government contracts work. My clients have received a grant. You know, maybe it's a national lab work or a college or university or some. But here are the things that we, you know, here's the reasons we're giving this money to accomplish these goals. I think when we're using the term grant here, it's a little bit different because you're talking about a pool of money that's given to a state or a local government who then turns around and issues an RFP that's probably a contract. It's probably not a grant at that point, but the grant, the way you're using it, I think, but you tell me, I think that term is a little different here.
I'm using it in the sense that there is a federal program. I'm talking about federal grants that you can submit an application to that, you know, department with a project in mind, seeking federal funding for that project. And then if you go through the process and you're awarded that money, so, you know, I'll use an example. I am city ABC in South Florida, and I have an important project to redo my sidewalks and, you know, street crossings and realign some of my streets to make better sense. And this whole entire project will cost $20 million to do. I'm going to submit a grant application seeking $20 million in grant funding from the U.S. Department of Transportation. And USDOT will then evaluate that application and say, you meet all of our criteria. This is a highly recommended project. You have great community support. You have great business support. And I get that $20 million. Now, that's the city, in order to then execute that $20 million grant award, might have to then solicit, you know, contractors that will help them build parts of that project in order to fulfill their obligation to DOT for accepting that $20 million. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's how I understood it. But it's for those of us in the government contract space, you're using the same word, grant, in two different ways. Right. It's not the case, for example, that if you're the construction company in South Florida, that you could apply for that grant yourself, which is the way we think of grants sometimes. But instead, it's the case that the city applies for the grant, the city gets the grant, and then the city goes through its own procurement process. So you're stuck with the city's procurement rules, but the federal rules are overlaid on top of that. So if you sign up for the city procurement, you're no doubt going to have those federal requirements imposed on you. But it is a different sort of grant, I think, in terms of how this person's thinking about it, frankly, how I was as well.
And that's totally, so for my perspective, maybe I should start off with a little bit more of my background, but so I'm a non-attorney representing local governments and nonprofits at the federal level. So the one thing that I talk about probably every single day is about grants. And I try to be the federal funding guru of how do you get federal money to be a part of your project on a competitive basis. So that's my vocabulary on a day-to-day basis, I just think, you know, that's how we just discuss things.
You're seeing the world from the perspective of a city, and I'm seeing the world from the perspective of a private entity. Right. Okay, well, we have one more minute, and I think we might have one more question, but if that person wants to follow up. Here's the last notice of funding opportunity. Any other high-level points you want to hit, Lisa, before we wrap up?
I just think there's a lot that's out there, and I think we're all trying to do our best to track where all of the dollars are going and where the opportunities are and how to think about them in order to be competitive at the federal level, right? Because I talked about that, you know, this money is not guaranteed through, you know, through formula dollars that you'll have to actually help people apply for the funding and be successful in getting an award.
That's great. Well, this is, here's Lisa's contact information and biography. Here's mine. We appreciate your time tuning in today. Please follow up if there's additional questions. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar next month. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.